Good morning. My name is Ashok. Welcome to MetaCulture Studio. Starting in 2008 and pretty much full time from 2013 2014, as the liberal world started visibly deteriorating, I found myself trying to alert people to what I saw as the real and present dangers to civilization. As you can see from the current state of India, the rise of authoritarian China, the economic and military weakening of the West, and the collapsing of social systems across the world, I may have been understating the urgency. Just for the record, without liberal democracies, ideas like peace, equality, and justice would be irrelevant. For that matter, without liberal democracy, you can give up on protesting the government's actions, reading your favorite author, or even talking candidly amongst friends. Those lovely folks in China, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and our own homegrown despots will tell us what is permissible. Since 2017, from my home office in Washington, D.C., I have been trying to educate people about our existential and civilizational crisis. You can find out more about our courses and activities from the link that we will put out on the chat. The Metaculture Studio conversations, of which you are today a part of, are an attempt to go back to the basic foundation that underpins all social activities, and I would even say civilized behavior itself, namely the warm and intelligent conversation. I don't know about you, but I'm tired of arguments, opinions, and angry people trying to beat up on each other. Here, we are not trying to persuade or even stimulate or excite, frankly. I don't mind if this is boring as long as it's real. Here, we are trying to model what gentle but meaningful conversations might look like. Each segment, I invite someone very special, not because he is a famous writer or because she is a brilliant scientist. My guests are here because they are sincere thinkers and good conversationalists whose company I enjoy. Welcome, Daniel.
Thanks, Ashok. It's a pleasure to come back to MetaCulture Studio and to join you today.
Wonderful. Again, you and I have known each other for a long, long time, and I have always enjoyed conversations with you. So, before we get started, Daniel, please, in about a minute, could you kind of introduce yourself to the group? Who is Daniel Yalowitz? And touch upon the professional or the personal, and around 60 to 90 minutes. Go for it.
Well, thanks, Ashok. It's always hard to kind of create an elevator speech in the moment, but I would say that I'm a New York City born and bred Jewish male, and mm, I've moved over the course of my life to increasingly smaller and smaller towns, from New York to Boston, and now my home in the high hills of Western Massachusetts. Um, I have just retired from a long career in academia, first as a professor at various colleges and universities, and more recently as a writer, trainer, and consultant. I've had the opportunity to do some of that around the world. And I'm a homebody more and more these days, partly because of COVID, partly by my own choice. And I enjoy time with my wife of 2 months and my cat of 15 years, and also my garden and bicycle. And I'm also a community activist. I do a lot of work in my hometown of Greenfield as chair of the Human Rights Commission, and working in other capacities in the city for social justice and behavior change, as it were. And that's where I am, and that's kind of a nugget on who I am.
Thank you so much. And, I can see that I can pick up many threads from what you have put out there and explore them. But given that we are going to be talking about friendship, particularly friendship in the age of COVID, and there's
Mhm.
just so much there to unpack. I'm going to ask you, and I'm asking you not just as a professor who has written a book on friendship, but also as a genuinely good friend, someone who has made friendship his kind of cornerstone in his life.
Mm.
Very briefly, in your own words, if possible, not as a professor, could you define what friendship is to you in the most personal terms, if possible?
Well, you're asking me to define a word and also speak from personal experience, and so I'll try to be as pragmatic as possible and get out of the uh, professor head, as it were. Um, so my friendships really are a way of relating to people who I choose or who choose me in a very personal, reciprocal manner. Two ways, not based on anything necessarily in particular, but a deep engagement with one another about what's real to each of us.
Hmm.
It's not a collegial relationship. It's not a professional relationship. And it's not a love or intimate romantic relationship. It can be intimate. Mind, I have many intimate friends, you being one of them, Ashok. And that, as I think about my friends, that kind of sums up the largest aspect of who I think of as my friends.
Thank you.
I'd add one more thing. There's
Sure.
a driven curiosity to get
Mhm.
to know things about each other that are beneath the headlines of our lives.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Interesting. And the, what you said makes me wonder at so many levels. And my first response is, wow, I would actually say pretty much the same thing. It's chosen, it's intentional, and we share so much, me and my friend. And it's not restricted to one thing or another. It doesn't necessarily, we don't necessarily have to share everything, but there's something reciprocal and all of that. And then I go back I go back to my experiences in smaller towns, in non Western cities, and I wonder if that's always the case. So, for instance, if I go back to my high school days, if I go back to my middle school days, and most friendships in a country like India, at least I don't know about right now, but definitely until 10, 15 years ago, where people you had met or grew up with. But in professional life, in adulthood, you may not have much in common with them. You may even not share anything. Some of my father's friends from college were clerical workers who, or secretaries to officials who didn't have either the education or the professional experience or the lifestyle of my dad. They didn't share anything except the ties that they had from 20, 30 years ago. But that friendship was very, very tight. And I'm wondering if your definition and mine is today a very American, individualistic idea. We share trekking, we share books, we enjoy this together, and therefore we have a bond. Do you want to just respond to that?
It's a fabulous question, Ashok, because I think you're opening the lens from outside the personal limited perspective and experience that any one person can have. And I can appreciate that you agree and support most of what I said as a
Right.
definition. Of course, I'd love to know
Absolutely.
if you could add more because no one definition of friendship can be comprehensive. Um, and it wouldn't be for me to say, because I have not done enough significant clinical or psychological research to say that this is universal.
Hmm.
Now, while I believe that friendship is a nearly universal human phenomenon,
Right.
I have to put the word nearly in, because I think it would be assumptive to say that friendship is absolutely universal. Of course, there are exceptions. But beyond the exceptions, I think there are some cultural boundaries or specifics around what is okay and what is not okay for friends and friendships, whether it's across gender, across generations, and other criteria. And so I think there is an inflection point across cultures around what is acceptable, how physically intimate can two men be in this culture, in the Western culture, in the US. Of course, there are understood, if not implicit, guidelines around how close men can be. That's not necessarily true around the world. So I think it's a complex question, but I do think that there is a human yearning and a human learning for people to be connected with one another beyond the roles of profession or idiosyncratic interest or whatever it is, to feel and be connected and to make meaning with other human beings.
No argument with you there. But the reason why I want to come back to those difference
Yeah,
between my friendships with Americans and
yeah,
my friendships with Indians that I have known for a long time is that I think it has a bearing to what is happening to the idea of friendships in the 21st century. Just to give you a sense, after we started talking, it struck me that in the last 30 years, or even 40 years,
mm.
my two closest friends, one in Bangalore and the other one in DC, are people with whom I have absolutely nothing in common. Absolutely nothing in common.
And yet you consider yourself to be friends with them.
No, my best friends. They are my
Absolutely.
best friends.
Okay.
I think for me, what is so striking about both those people is that they are very conservative, hopelessly middle class, materialistic, Christian, religious people, and they would have done pretty much anything for me, and I would have done anything for them in a way that most of my other American friends or European friends, the moment we leave cities, the moment we stop enjoying an activity or we start disagreeing politically, it disappears. It disappears. The whole friendship dissipates. I'm reminded of your experience of moving from Boston to
Mm,
Northampton and how it was almost like a continental divide. And
mm.
for me, there's a reason. I'm not trying to just establish that there are different kinds of friendships. I hear you. You agree with me on that. I wonder if the Western idea of reciprocal friendships is what is making friendships so vulnerable and is making friendship itself an endangered activity. It's not even an activity, a phenomenon. So let's come to COVID and let's talk about something that you and I have touched on earlier. At what point did you feel that friendships were becoming too tenuous and were starting to become diluted? When in the last 20,
Mm.
30 years, Daniel, did you start realizing that the friendships you had in the 60s and 70s and even 80s was changing?
Well, and I want to respond by also asking you, after I respond, to speak from your own experience. It's hard to, in my mind, and through my work, it's hard to define a particular date. But when I look back over the course of my life and on a larger scale, kind of cultural life in the world, particularly in the West, in the USA, I would say that the advent of technology as a precursor to the technological revolution of computers and their spin-offs, the advent of television. So, for example, even though my experience contradicts a little bit of this, I think when you open the lens, you get, I believe, that focusing on television as a solitary activity that's non-interactive, it's not reciprocal, at the exclusion of having time with family or friends or drop-bys or whatever it is, that began to slowly circumscribe relationships, friendships. And then the computer revolution did even more of that. Now, my experience tells me that television, for me, was an opportunity in a very close-knit family in New York City to gather around and watch Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In or silly programming. But the point is, we were all there together, and it gave us something to relate to. In addition to life in general, we could deconstruct these programs. We could laugh at them. We could laugh at ourselves. We could see ourselves in them, and that was a family bonding tool, to the extent that we did these things together, or went to movies together. But I don't know that that's something I can generalize to the American or human experience. What would you say about this from your experience?
I think I would agree with you that technology, starting with entertainment technology, let's think about it. Even a telephone, when it came, I mean, you didn't have speaker phones in the old dial-ups. And if your father got a call from someone, or if your sister got a call from her friend, that was an individual experience. Very different from your sister's friend showing up and the whole family kind of congregating around there to see what this guy is like, and whether his intentions are honorable, and whether he's decent enough to have in the midst of the home, or whatever it was. I think the telephone was, for me, the first individuated technology. And then, of course, I agree with you, television may have offered in the beginning an opportunity for the family or the neighbors to come together. But the moment affluence, so you see, there's a difference between one TV in the house, in the living room, and two TVs. The moment the parents or the teenager has another TV in their home, all bets are off. All bets are off in terms of shared experiences, right? And then, of course, I want to share an experience. When I was in the National Institute of Design in 1977, I believe, one of my classmates, she was more affluent, more westernized, she got the first Walkman amongst my peers. It blew everything away. The moment one person got a Walkman, that person was no longer interested in the same music that the others played on their tape recorders.
Yes.
Sitting in the studios, there was usually a tape recorder. There had to be some kind of consensus about what kind of music was played, and we all listened to something while working. The moment this person in the studio put on her earbuds or headphones, she disappeared.
Yeah.
She wasn't there anymore. Even her expressions changed. The rest of us, she looked at us through glassy eyes.
Yeah.
And this is in 77. So I can only imagine what has happened over the past 30 to 40 years. So to fast forward, Daniel, tell me how, beyond technology, how has COVID, and I know that everyone here has experienced it, so we are not going to be telling them something profoundly unique, but just to put it on the table, what are the ways in which COVID, in your experience, has made friendships so much harder to create and maintain?
So this is really an area of deep interest to me, Ashok. And again, my response is more of a personal one. I have done research. I'm very curious about the impact of this, not on a generation, not on a city or country or whatever, a state, a region, but this has really become a global and universal experience. And while I think it's impacted some people more than others, it's impacted all of us in some ways. And we've seen the various reactions people have to things that have become part of the common parlance. Masking up, social distancing, and so on. And I think, to me, the damage or the potential for damage in social relationships like friendships has been the prolonged, and in many cases, the extreme insularity and isolation of people from one another. And this is happening on many levels, but primarily the socially connected level, the emotional opportunity to do deep sharing, and all of it is permeated by fear. And there's a flight or fight phenomenon that goes on that I think has tamped down the opportunities that most of us have had. And I speak about here not so much the engagement between friends, but the opportunities have changed. Many people aren't going outside as much. As the weather gets colder, we have fewer and fewer choices. We have to turn to social media and platforms on computers if we have them, or get onto FaceTime on our phones if we have that. But all of it is a certain form of social distancing. You and I right now are on StreamYard, and you are a 1 inch by 2.5 inch box. And so am I. We can connect that way, but I really think that the third dimension, which is in person, has suffered greatly. And whereas most of the attention has gone to the physical and medical side of the impact of COVID, as a psychologist, I'm much more invested in the interpersonal, social, emotional sides. And I think a huge toll has been had, certainly by some cohorts more than others, but by everyone to a certain extent. Anything you'd add?
Again, sorry, no, this is very useful, Daniel. And what I keep doing with all my guests is to ask for going beyond analysis, beyond theorizing, beyond. Can you give the example of one friend and how your relationship with him or her has changed through COVID? I mean, again, you don't have to mention the name,
No.
but I think if you can just give us a picture of what it was like, a pre-COVID relationship, friendship, and how that kind of changed during these last 2 years. I think we would all get a better idea of this.
Well, I'm going to pick two relationships to focus on here. And many people wouldn't necessarily see these two individuals, and I'll name them by their role in my life, not by their names. I'm going to think about my two parents, who, beyond their parenting role and the intergenerational stuff, over the course of my adult life in particular, have become very dear friends. People that I can relate to personally, who I'm really connected with. We share activities, we share common thoughts about a lot of things. And of course, we share the history of my life with them. But COVID has had a particularly profound impact. They both had apartments in New York City. And of course, I'm 5 hours away by train and 4 hours by car. And they're both in their 90s at this point in time. And it shut down the opportunity to visit with them. And that was COVID related. That was for their safety. That was for my safety, coming from a very small town and having to be exposed to a city of 8 million people. And because of their technological limitations, which are generational, it was only in the last couple of months at best that we were able to get them on computer or FaceTime or Zoom. And each time was a reteaching of how to use the technology. I'm not a master teacher at this, but I got through with them. But the lack of visitation, the lack of experiencing rites of passages with them, our annual Thanksgiving, our annual Passover Seders, removed a certain degree of intimacy. And it's not really possible to make that up by phone, much as I was talking to them 2-3 times a week. These are lifetime friends, right from my inception, when I got to know them from outside the womb. And I feel a tremendous loss at that. And the loss of time is not something you can make up. You can't compensate for that. But always in my mind, always in my heart, near enough by on the phone or whatever technology. But there was something lacking from the third dimensional experience. And that's impacted me profoundly, given especially their age. Do you have a similar?
Firstly, now can I first respond to Daniel?
Sure. Yeah.
I think it's just so wonderful that you were able to share the example of parents being friends at the level that we are talking about. Very few people, I think, would be fortunate enough to count their parents as best friends. And I think I'm so glad you put it out there, particularly because I know you have lost your mother very recently, and I can only imagine what a astonishing or even profound loss that is. I really take to heart what you have talked about in terms of the lack of intimacy over the last year and a half of your mother's life. Having said that, I want to take a step back, Daniel. And what I want to ask is, so far we've been talking of individual friendships. We've been talking about how friendships have changed, have changed, one because of technology and two because of the pandemic. We've also touched on friendships changing because we are very mobile. We are moving from city to city, country to country, all of which takes a toll on friendship. So here's my big question. What does this shift in terms of friendships, the weakening of the spirit of friendship, the difficult to maintain and sustain friendships, what are the implications on society? Does the larger system, our social system, I know you're not a sociologist, but we are just talking as reasonably intelligent people who have been thinking about these issues. So I don't want to go into theory again, as I keep trying to say. But what do you think the impact is on your children, or on your nephews and nieces, and on the next generation itself, or the next 2 generations, when we lose the kind of intimacy that previous generations have experienced through deep, meaningful friendships?
I'm looking at some of the younger generation in my family. My niece of 7.5 years and my granddaughter of 1.5 years. And so in particular, when I zoom in on those two, what I'm seeing is that the modeling of their parents becomes critical, especially with the loss, not so much for the granddaughter of mine, Naomi, but for Zevi at 7.5, the loss for a significant amount of time of schooling. And all the interpersonal reactions that represents. The fact that her parents, my brother Billy and his partner Sarah, have had so much opportunity to engage in creative ways with their social peers, their friends. There's a there's an opportunity for the younger generation to see that as role modeling. Of course, they wouldn't call it that, but they see it happening. And so the opportunity to have masked play dates or other opportunities on computer or other creative and innovative ways to connect with their friends becomes paramount, has become paramount. And so I think the modeling that is on the generation that is now in control, so to speak, or at least they're of adult level to take responsibility for their own friendships, kids learn a lot from that. And
Can I
I've
just
seen,
intrude?
huh?
Can I intrude, Daniel?
Yeah,
I apologize for this, but it seems to me like you're talking about an exceptional group of people here. People who have time, people who are really into child development and all of that. And that's not the world I'm talking about at all. I
okay,
am not talking about extraordinarily privileged people who are sensitive and who want to compensate for everything that's happening in the world. 99% of the world parents do not have the privilege of thinking like that. So I want you for a moment to step away from the extremely rarefied world that you're talking about. I am concerned about democracy. I am concerned about the civilization itself, the culture we are part of.
sure.
If you and I can just step away from our personal lives, where I'm quite certain we know people who are able to step up to the plate to compensate for the problems in society. Let's talk about the ordinary people where both parents are so busy just putting food on the table,
Right.
or it's a single parent home, or they are in societies where, I mean, nobody understands anything about child development or, how to do homeschooling. And they're totally crippled by the fact that kids can't go to school. Okay. Now, in that situation, and I'm not talking the very poor, I'm talking the middle class people too.
I hear you. I hear you.
How is how are those people going to understand what it means to be friends? I, before I ask you to respond to this, I'll just give you one example. I know, and I don't want to mention anyone, but I know so many young people who do not even know how to have a 5-minute conversation with anyone. And that within those 3 minutes, they will go onto their cell phone and they will be browsing, or they are happier sending chat messages or sending photographs than engaging in a conversation, even with each other. So for me, what does all this have to do with, or rather, what is the impact of all of this on society? Will people grow up like you or me? Not that we are exemplars of any kind. I'm messed up, but at least I appreciated friendships. So, all yours.
Well, this is a societal, if not global, problem. I'm not going to pretend to have any answers or solutions, but we are seeing in the U.S. as well as in many other countries, what I say is a shredding of the social fabric. I mean, it's just happening. I know that sounds cliche, but people are short-circuiting conversations where there's the slightest hint of disagreement or conflict. We see this in our politics day in and day out. There's no way around that, and it extends, I think, Ashok, to other things. People just, even friends, have a lack of patience with one another or tolerance to really listen. And I think part of it is based on fear, because we're seeing death all around us, and illness and horror stories that we can't ignore anymore. This is no longer the exception. In any town or village or hamlet or city, we're seeing these kinds of things happening. And I know this sounds theoretical, but I'm feeling it, and not just in this country. I was in China just before the pandemic began in December of 2019, and I had a large group of Chinese students, and they went back home after my 10 days of training, and And I found out 3 months later that 2 of them had passed. They lived in
Oh God.
Wuhan, and they were at the epicenter of this issue. And so it impacts on us in all manner of ways. So there's fear that leads to isolation and insularity, and that leads to depression and anxiety, and even a lessening of self-confidence and competence in the world. And it just goes on. And there's not enough contradiction, I believe, to bring it back. And I think this is a real social failing. And you're right. I gave an example of my family, which is unique, perhaps, or at least idiosyncratic. And I don't want to pretend that that's out there in any large measure. But I take solace in thinking that that's part of the response for those who are privileged enough to have the time and the intelligence, the intuition, whatever it is, to make those connections much more obvious. I don't know if there's more you would add from your experience or that you would disagree with, but that's how I'm seeing this whole thing. It's a cultural, to me, it's a key pan-cultural issue.
I hear you. I totally, and I agree with you pretty much on everything here. Uh, I guess I'm coming from a place, Daniel, where I feel helpless. I feel helpless. And this is what has prompted my moving away from a professional life as a conflict resolution consultant, as a mediator, as a dialogue facilitator, because I don't see any value in that kind of work anymore. I can't kid myself that if I work with a group and help them manage a conflict better or understand each other better, anything is going to change. Because if you know history, and if you are burdened by the knowledge of history, if you understand this way the larger system works, you cannot but be terrified by the tsunami that's on its way. One could say that the tsunami is already raining on us. So for me, this collapse in human relationship building capabilities has huge implications for societal health, individual mental health, but also our capacity to build trust, our ability to create reasonably harmonious ways of coexisting with each other. Nothing can be taken for granted anymore. Nothing.
Yeah.
Nothing.
Well, let me try offering a visual analogy here for you, Ashok, and those who are listening in, because I think it helps to make all of this theoretical construction of ideas around friendship just a little more real. And so my analogy here is to take something that's very mundane and compare it and translate it into friendship. So I'm going to take, and all that we've been talking about, I think really lends itself to this idea, in my opinion, which is I want to take the analogy of a rubber band. And, you know, if you can actually imagine holding one in your hands and substituting the word for friendship, or substituting the word friendship for rubber band. Friendships, like rubber bands, the best ones are able to stretch and move and contract and be smaller and stronger and move in different ways. And lifelong friendships, I think, those very few that we may have, are able to be flexible and move up and down, in and out, small and large. But sometimes, and I think we're seeing this a lot, where friendship is because of COVID and the economies of many different countries in the world, unemployment, all the social issues that we're struggling with today. We're seeing a fraying or a stretching of that rubber band to the point where it's weakening in one or more areas or snapping altogether. And that is the collapse that we're talking about as far as friendship. Rubber bands can only go so far. Well, so can friendships. And time and distance, to a certain extent, can be overcome. It takes creativity, it takes privilege, wealth, and so on to do that, I think. But sometimes they snap out of control for things that are beyond our doing. And COVID is one of them. And so is the economy and employment. It's bigger than any one of us or even any group of us.
Right.
And, I go back to my earlier years and I saw these rubber bands of friendship and I thought, these are for life. They're steady, they're strong, they're reciprocal. And what I look at now is quite different. There's very few from childhood, very few, maybe on one hand. And I think I'm lucky to even say that. But then other things have come together. Other new friendships have come together. Yeah. So I'll leave that and feel free to comment or respond, react.
I love your analogy of the rubber band or your metaphor of the rubber band. Thank you. I love the idea of it fraying, but also stretching beyond a point or breaking. So my question for you, and feel free to ask me questions yourself, but I have so many questions to ask you. My question, taking the rubber band further, is this: what happens when the stresses and strains on the rubber band become too much and most of those friendships fray or break? And I'm talking about the younger generation that didn't even have your or my advantage of phenomenal relationships 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Okay. I'm talking about people in the age of COVID, in the age of those little screens that they carry with them, totally switched off from the rest of the world. What happens to people like that when they know their parents? Yes, they may feel enormous intimacy with their parents, and that's wonderful. But they've never experienced friendships, because it's one thing to grow up in a home. Let's just assume even that's a privilege, a really solid nuclear family that lives together. Let's just assume that, okay? You feel close to your parents. You get love and affection from your parents. It's reciprocal. But outside of that intimate family circle, you've never had a chance to build relationships with non-family members. You haven't experienced what friendship is. What happens to a society under those circumstances?
Well, thanks for that question, Ashok. It's, we don't have to look that far back in history to see that disaffected children, young people, are, this is not a singular phenomenon. And I think of all the school shootings, all the violence on the streets. If you look at the perpetrators, and I'm not making a judgment, but just looking at them, and this is not theoretical, this is real, and it's in our newspapers, it's in our communities. It permeates so much of the news and our lives. Who's doing this? These are kids who have really struggled. They have struggled in their families. They're disaffected. They don't have what I would consider to be normal or connected social relationships or friendships. And that is what's driving the kind of cultural paranoia, really, on a certain level, of being worried to go out into streets or communities or whatever. And those children, are simply an indicator of a culture that's running amok. They're individual actions, but they're coming from a larger social phenomenon of being lost, being isolated, being unable to know how to connect, either because they're being driven by their computers and technology more and more into their own black hole, or they lack the skills that we need, the emotional and social intelligence. That sounds theoretical. It's not.
It's not.
Real.
It's not theoretical.
Yeah.
I'm totally with you. And sometimes, we have to call on reasonably formal language to explain certain things. So I'm totally with you there. You used a very important phrase, running amok. Now, I want to take the emphasis away from young people alone.
Okay.
What happens to society itself when you have an entire generation of people who don't know what it is to build friendships, who are looking for stimulation? In other words, I love trekking. If you trek with me, man, we are friends. Oh, I loved going to book readings, and if you also enjoy the same thing, we are friends. Now, that for me is the lowest kind of friendships, and I have to say, most American friendships I know are like that. But we'll leave that aside for the moment. The point is, if people do not know what it is to get to know someone, to get to trust someone, to get to care about someone outside of their family, outside of their romantic relationships, then what happens to society at large? I mean, and here, and I'm just going to throw some of these words, what happens to any society that wants to maintain a kind of peace and harmony? What happens to democracy itself? Can we, and I'm going to ask a really difficult question for us and for the and for anyone who is listening in, what what happens to feminism? What happens race relations? What happens to equality and justice if we lose this entire, if the rubber band snaps? There are no more real friendships, and everything is transactional, it's reciprocal. Can you even say that I live in a society that aspires for equality, justice, freedom, human rights? Is it possible? I'm just putting it out there, Daniel. Pick up any thread you want. I'm just
Well,
curious.
this is precisely why I wrote the book, Reflections on the Nature of Friendship. But I'm not plugging it. I'm simply saying that I, like you, what I saw happening, what I was experiencing around me, what I was struggling with is how do I stay connected to people through COVID, through the wanton violence that's going on. We've spoken about that already. And I am, and I have become more and more worried that what's the answer? Is the answer this kind of myth, the American myth of rugged individualism? Is that where we're going? It's what I'm seeing. And I'm seeing it in our politics. I'm seeing it, there's so much violence that's being perpetrated and perpetuated. And even in friendships, there seems to be less listening, less patience, less tolerance. I may feel like my friendships are an exception, but if that's true, and I can't judge that, it's still the preponderant experience that I'm seeing around me, that people are feeling lonely, alone. I termed the coin a loneliness as an existential experience that people are having, and they're looking, they're searching, they're desperate, and they're highly anxious and depressed. I'm not going to use those words clinically,
Right.
but I see that all around me, and I think that this is an area that's not being addressed in the same way that we're trying to get vaccinations into everyone's arms. I'm not judging that, but that in itself is not going to be enough. The quality of life and connectedness is suffering and failing, and I'm worried about it. That's how I feel. I don't know if you want to add to that or put on your own perspective.
You know, I feel stymied. Honestly, I feel totally stymied. For the last 7 years, I have almost completely focused on what it takes to sustain or even save our liberal, relatively humane, democratic world. I see it collapsing everywhere. I think the US is probably past the tipping point, but we are nowhere near collapsing yet. But the tipping point is gone. And for me, beyond the economy, beyond elections, beyond even who rules, the idea of a humane society is that one where people have a certain amount of trust in each other. And for me, friendships are the building blocks of trusting people outside our clan,
That's good.
outside our
That's good.
bloodline. And one of the things I want to put out there is, you see, I grew up, by American standards, I mean, one wouldn't call it affluent, but definitely by my context, it was very affluent. I grew up playing sports, and by that I mean team sports. I have to say, almost everything I learned about sharing, about cooperating, came from football. That's the real football, not
Yeah.
American football. I refuse to call it soccer. It's football. Cricket, playing doubles in tennis or badminton, playing field hockey, playing basketball. And it's in those team activities when you are not with your parents or siblings with whom the bond is very different, that you discover how important it is to count on someone else, to enjoy a secular friendship, a relationship, and I see so many people who are deprived of such experiences. And on top of it, even in your neighborhood, you do not have young children growing around with their neighbors' kids anymore. Everyone is so terrified, they keep their kids like this, in either their playpens or in their backyards where they are safe. And as a result, how are we likely to have any kind of a society in the classical context of a group of people that comes together because they share something and there's interdependence? How do we even have such a society? And I'm just putting it out there because I'll be honest with you, I am just terrified about where we are going.
It's a somber thought that you share, and a question. And I want to go back to the element of sports, and I'm glad that you and perhaps a lot of folks listening in have had very positive experiences with this. Mine, not so much so. And I was a very athletic little kid. I grew up in the middle of Manhattan, and there were dozens, and more dozens of kids across cultures, from the high rises that I lived in. But there was a uniquely American phenomenon. I call it uniquely American because I don't know if this is true in other locales around the world, where we had this phenomenon known as choosing sides. And this is the way you got into teams. And it happened to me only occasionally, but I saw it happening to other kids about being the last one chosen. And I've used the word disaffection often already, but that's a step down. I could see the dejection, and I felt it for myself those few times where it happened to me. So there's positives and negatives to a lot of things, and overall, in this case, the reason for writing the book, as I've said, and just for thinking about friendships and talking about them and coming to you or with you today, is because I too am frightened. And I don't see, as I said earlier, enough to contradict the overwhelm of isolation, of loss of connection. What can possibly replace that except more and more sinking into oneself? And there's a great danger because our culture is largely predicated on relationships that are relational as opposed to transactional. You've said that already. Where do we go? How do we get that back? I don't really have a one-size-fits-all answer. I just know
Right.
that we have to really be passionate about thinking about this and living it and bringing examples, as you and I have tried to do here, uh, to try to look at that and say, what is going on with this? And not just leave it as the headline, but asking, is there more? What's underneath this? And that's where the analysis comes in and the reflection. And that's only useful if we do something about it.
I think
Otherwise, it's all work.
I want to take that last point you made. All this analysis is only good if we do something about it. And Daniel, I want to tell you and anyone who is listening that I am sick and tired of not judging. When your house is burning, you darn well better be honest enough and brave enough to judge that this fire is not good. There is no way, it's like I'm speaking more out of my frustration with the pseudo sophisticated idea that we that there's good and bad. There is nothing good when your society is collapsing. So I really like what you said. That analysis is only good if we do something about it. And for me, at this point in time, given my vantage point of having worked on nothing else for the past 7 years and having seen every fear of mine come true, starting with my own country in India. Okay, and seeing, I've been saying for years, and it's not about whether America should have gone into Afghanistan or not. I mean, that is grotesque. We won't get into it. But how could anyone have imagined? And it takes an enormous arrogance of a Western progressive mind to think that you can go into a pretty much medieval society and you can bring your ideas of women's empowerment, ideas of equality for minority groups, including gays, and not expect that the moment you take your troops away, everything will collapse. So the point I want to make is we are literally at the cusp of an enormous collapse at multiple levels. And the only thing that can keep us going is friendships. I say not even family, because family is so small and so vulnerable. And with globalization, urbanization, increased mobility, we don't have extended families anymore.
Right.
Most of us, at best, we are in touch with our siblings. Many of us are not even in touch with our siblings. At a time like this, if we lose as a people the capacity to build friendships with strangers, with neighbors, with colleagues, and if we have trouble investing in it, what are we going to do when the ground is cut from under us? And this is something that I'm very, very terrified about. So I see that there are questions for us, Daniel. Feel free to pick up any question that you want. And I leave it to you to pick the first question. There's, yeah, go on.
Well, let's see. Let me just take a minute to look at some of the questions that have come in. Someone made a statement here, and ending in a question, which is, would either of you have any reflections on the changing backdrop of friendship? And I think we've been speaking a lot to that, but I think I can add a little bit more. We've talked a lot about the changing nature of culture. We've talked about COVID. We've talked about violence and so on. And I would be very interested in hearing your response as well, Ashok. But I would say that, and I'm going to just use the U.S. because I'm a little more thoroughly familiar with life here, as I've done almost no traveling since going to China 2 years ago. And my concern is that uh, politics and the world is moving on in very twisted and unimaginable ways that none of us have really experienced. And we lack the social and emotional intelligence to keep caught up with that. We're losing the problem-solving battle around friendship. We may be winning it in some ways. I think we're losing it in most ways. I would imagine you might agree, environmentally and so many other forms. But I think we're losing ground around the changing backdrop of friendship, which is why friendships are fraying and why the rubber band is snapping. So that's a start. And I wonder if you would want to add more to that.
Absolutely. And I want to read out Rukmini's entire question, which I think is one that I've heard before. And a lot of people are wondering about this. She says, many people have been sharing how they have bonded deeply with people across the globe in the process of the pandemic. Digital relationships seem to be as strong as traditional local friendships. So thank you, Rukmini. You are voicing the experience and the feelings of many people who have, at some levels, benefited from the Zoom revolution,
Yes.
the connecting through the internet. And I want to say that this has also been going on way before COVID. I have been talking and writing about this phenomenon for the past 15 to 20 years because I have seen peers and colleagues of mine who have whose lives have become enriched because of relationships 5,000, 10,000 miles away. One of the first things, and I want to step back before I answer this, one of the first things that I realized when I came to the US in 95 was how, and again, I confess I was in a very liberal, progressive part of the US. If I were in Alabama or Tennessee, it would have been a different experience. But in New York, in Boston, California, most of the people I met were international. By that I mean these were Americans who had visited, done Peace Corps, lived for years elsewhere, and who counted as great friends, people who lived 5, 10,000 miles away. Even the politics was totally focused on helping people in Somalia, or Burkina Faso, or Ethiopia, or Indonesia, or India, or wherever else. And I was blown away by the compassion and the empathy they had for people 5,000 or 10,000 miles away. It took me a while to realize that they were almost always utterly negligent of their neighbors. And so it took me a couple of years to realize that this empathy for people 5 to 10,000 miles away, which fed them and brought out a lot of idealistic generosity, was at the expense of deeper, meaningful friendships and relationships with family, with the neighborhood, with individuals on a face-to-face basis. Let me just finish this, Daniel. So my response to Rukmini, and it's something that people have asked me about MetaCulture courses. I have made it a point to say my courses will always be less effective digitally than face-to-face. But one of the things that has come out of my courses is I attract people from all over the world. And it's like people are so thankful that there are people from Japan and there are people from Turkey and there are people from Ecuador in my courses, and they think that is good. I disagree. Don't get me wrong. I'm totally happy to have people from other countries. However, I also know that this is a very tenuous connection. There's excitement, there's cheerleading. Yes, Ashok, this is a great course. I'm so delighted to connect with people from everywhere. There is a consumption angle to it. It is almost like eating exotic food in a restaurant. I do not believe that these digital relationships are anywhere as strong as traditional or local relationships. It is very stimulating. and it makes me feel good, and it makes me feel like I have gotten an insight into another culture. But it's in my, as someone who's really focused on deep learning and deep teaching, I find the entire digital experience extremely shallow. Daniel, please go ahead.
I will. I'd like to respond to that and tie it into another question that someone has asked. I actually have a slightly different perspective on that, in that I am not satisfied by what the internet and Zoom and so on can offer, but it's still an opportunity. And I have seen some friendships grow that are international, or that where face-to-face meetings at this point would just not be possible. And the best of those friendships, like rubber bands, can adhere to one another. And I know friends in my town who have started relationships that some of whom have become intimate through the internet. Now, those are generally the exception, but I think we have to find a starting place. And right now with COVID, and we're sinking back in the Northern Hemisphere into fall and winter, and a second cycle now around the seasons where we're going to become increasingly isolated. It's still a start. And I have a little bit of hope that that's better than nothing. And again, there are going to be a vast number of exceptions where it stays superficial, it dies off, and it's gone, you know. But lacking other opportunities, it's better than nothing. And I think Quanta has asked.
Before you take that one, before
Yeah.
you take that, and I'm glad you want to take on Quanta, I have to say that, you and I, because we are friends, I can say this very clearly. I think I completely disagree with you, Daniel, because I think you and I are talking of two different things. You're talking about some value that comes from digital friendships. I'm not questioning that at all.
Oh, okay.
So it's very important we recognize, because I have a problem with the little good, little bad approach to life. When your house is collapsing, I'm going to say that you cannot say, well, the heat is actually helping my neighbor because he was feeling cold. That's a grotesque way of looking at a crisis situation for me. For me, and I really want to put it across, we are at the tip of the abyss. And we need to recognize that what digital technology does is it completely transforms our expectations in terms of what is a relationship. And the problem with digital technology is not that everything results in a marriage or everything results in a lifelong a friendship. No, the problem with this technology is that it inspires us to go 5,000 miles away.
Yes.
And to put our attention and our investment 5,000 miles away, rather than with our neighbor who's irritating. If I do not know how to build trust and to be generous towards my irritating neighbor, towards my second cousin who is 2 blocks away and who is a jerk, if I do not know how to build a relationship there, no amount of relationships, deep connections with people in Burkina Faso or Japan or Canada is going to help me when my society collapses. That is the point I'm trying to make. But I'd like you to respond to the question that Quanta asks you.
Well, it leads us back into talking more about this. Quanta's question is, will the collapse of friendships, I suppose, provide opportunities for rebuilding something better? And we've been struggling with that question, Quanta, for the duration of our conversation today, looking for solutions, resolutions, answers, possibilities. And this is, in a way, this is a question: is the glass half empty or half full? That seems a bit cliche. If anything, I think the glass is pouring out. But we've seen in history, time and again, that uh, societal change does bring something else. Not always good, but something else. And it's the nature of the world that death brings birth and new life. Um, I get a little scared by thinking, well, in this case, what do we replace the breakdown of friendship with? What else is there? And I think, Ashok, you asked that question.
Right.
And well, I'll say this, and I think your point about being very friendly with people halfway across the world, but not with our own neighbors, is deeply problematic. And I think the problem is that people are more and more being driven to doing things that feel safe,
right,
and secure. And from a distance, from a deep distance, any kind of interaction is distant, is more removed from the three-dimensional, how do I deal with conflict here?
Thank you.
That's the essence of this. So I don't know what will replace friendship, what grows out of it. But I think we have to start by thinking it's a problem. It impacts me. It impacts my neighbors, my family, and it's relevant. And getting into conversations like this, and then saying, well, let's make meaning out of this. This is not just a passerby conversation, but it comes back to this question, what can I do?
Right. Thank you, Daniel.
And own it. What can I do with you? What can I do with other people? How can I reach out of myself? And not because what goes around comes around, just because I feel that inside myself, that it makes more meaning for me. Go ahead.
Thank you. Daniel, again, I have to say, I love you deeply, and I totally disagree with you, because I would respond to Quanta's thing as saying, Quanta, this is a very American approach. When I say American, I believe that it's a society, a nation that has had an entire continent to exploit, that has had the origins of America and American thinking is that anything is possible. And as long as we are positive and we look at the right side and we are optimistic, we can bring about change. That's not the experience of most societies across the world. Societies across the world have made peace with trauma, made peace with tragedy, something that Americans have historically had difficulty with. So your question, will the collapse provide opportunities for rebuilding something, is for me a very dangerous question, because it's not based on evidence. It's not based on planning. It's based on a wishful idea that somehow out of this chaos, something good will come. And then we retrofit theories as to why after every collapse, something good comes. If your loved one is dying from cancer, the thought that comes to your mind is not, will something good come after my beloved dies? That's not what you think about. So why are we willing to think about that in terms of society itself? I really believe that we need to recognize that this is a terrible point in human history. I know I don't win converts with this approach. I know people don't like to hear this because they want to hear voices of inspiration and positivity. But that is itself the problem at a time like this. I also want to say, Shri asked a very good question. She's wondering if the friendship started breaking down before technology, or it was already weak before that with the movement towards individual achievements. Shri, simple answer, yes. Friendships and relationships have been breaking down for decades. There are many reasons. Daniel and I have touched on some of them, technology being one of it. But even before that, the moment you move away from tribal societies and extended families and you move towards urban living, you are disconnecting yourself from the people who are naturally the most disposed to take care of your well-being, to strangers with whom you need to build a connection and hope that they will care enough for you. Colleagues, friends, lovers, neighbors, and with increased mobility. Your father gets transferred, your mother gets another job somewhere else, you move for education and everything else. Every time you move, you are starting with a clean slate in that neighborhood, in that company, in that college. And it takes enormous effort to build and rebuild and lose friendships and relationships. So, yes, this is not a COVID phenomenon. It is something that's been happening ever since the, I would say, globalization and hyper urbanization. You use the term individual achievements, and I know you've talked in the past about your skepticism of success, of a success driven society, and I'm with you there. But I would say that's part of the problem, Sri. Individual achievement, that I read it as a very narrow focus on the self and the aspirations and ambitions of the self. That's part of the problem. If I really want to finish a book that I'm writing, I will withdraw from the people I want to spend time with in order to focus on the book. I become more jealous of my time. I become less patient with digressions, less patient with people who are taking away my time. And what we haven't realized is that the history of human relationships is on having spare time to waste. It is when you have nothing to do and you're shooting the breeze with a friend or a cousin or just sitting around watching the clouds go by that you develop an ease with the other person. So I'm just going to put it out there that I don't think it serves anyone to keep looking for the positive at a time like this. And if we do, we postpone. That almost becomes a way to postpone action today. Well, the data isn't all there. Well, after World War II, we climbed back. You know, societies go through cycles. These are very dangerous assumptions which are not based on data about our present crisis. And for me, now that we're coming back, and in the interest of wrapping up, I just want to remind everyone that um, if we cannot understand how dangerous our present moment is, we probably don't deserve to continue to exist. Historically, no society, no species that wasn't able to secure itself was able to survive. That's the nature of extinction. Leo has asked a very good question. What role does friendship play in the development of democracy itself? Wonderful question. I tried touching it. I'm going to add a couple of things and give it back to Daniel. I want him to take the last question, whichever he wants to respond to. But Leo, great question. I see democracy not as elections. I don't see democracy as merely equal rights, justice, giving voice to minorities. All of these are secondary. What democracy is at the philosophic core is this: a group of people who come together and choose to govern themselves. And when you choose to govern yourselves, you are accepting that each person there is worthy of being listened to, is worthy of having their needs met, is worthy of compromising for. The nature of democracy is friendship. You cannot have a democracy without ties of friendships across different groups. Now, obviously, there's a personal relationship and a personal friendship which is far more intimate than a societal series of friendship. But what democracy does is that it tells me I'm not the only person here. It tells me my needs are not the only needs. That my neighbor at the other end of the town, 20 miles away, he or she is affected by my my choices in terms of the budget. And it's important for me to take their needs into consideration. That in order to do that, I have to trust them. If I don't trust my neighbor 20, my co-inhabitant 20 miles away, I will not think their needs are as important as mine. Democracy cannot exist without enormous compromises. And I make those compromises because I see my friend 20 miles away as being as worthy of my generosity. So I'm going to stop there. Daniel, is there another question that you would like to deal with?
Well, I would like to add a little bit. I thought your analysis, your response there was brilliant. I'd like to add a little bit, and then I'd like to see if we have time for one more question. There are two things that occur to me in Leo's question. What role does friendship play in the development of democracy? I think you did a beautiful job. I want to add two things quickly. One is that democracy requires what's known in psychology as the process of decentering, away from oneself. And that's, to me, a contradiction with what capitalism is. So on that level, the ability for an individual or even a group to decenter away from only looking at and acting on its own needs and wants is the beginning of moving, I think, toward a more of a democratic social construct. The second, which we haven't spoken of, and I realize that this word has been so overused that it may well be in the trash bin, but I'm going to go with it for the moment, which is the integrity, the structural integrity of friendship. If there is integrity, and Ashok has claimed words that I use often in my book around trust, empathy, compassion, listening, respect. These are big words and they can go in a lot of different places. But if you put all those together and you have those with another person in a reciprocal relationship, then I would say that relationship, whether or not it's friendship, has integrity. It can become a friendship the more we are able to be reciprocal and outside of ourselves. And the more we're able to do that, the more we are moving toward a democracy.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah. So friendship and democracy, if friendship is an interpersonal thing on a one-to-one or small group level, democracy is that writ large, culturally, globally, systemically. And the two do have to go hand in hand.
Can I just suggest something, Daniel? Two things. One is, if you're game and if Shri and Leo are game, they are backstage. I would like to take a few extra minutes to address some of the other questions.
Sure.
I see that our common friend Patrick has 2 to 3 questions. If you don't mind, would you take one of Patrick's questions now?
Sure. And I was looking at them. And Patrick, thanks for joining us. Patrick asks, I'll try this one, and then I'll let you do the other one if you want, Ashok.
Sure.
What is the connection between cancel culture and friendship? Well, boy, oh boy, if that's not topical and relevant and current, thinking about this, because we've probably all heard the terms cancel culture and microaggression and all the related terminology that we're stuck with there. And it's real. It's happened to me. I've seen things blow up because of my own politics, such as they are, and trying to cross the political divide, and in the process being canceled. And so any hope for friendship is also canceled in the sense that people become very quickly dismissive or unable to touch on conflict, or more than touch on it, respond to it deeply. And so what happens then is the rubber band and the social fabric of friendships splits just like that. There's no time for fraying. It just snaps. And I think there is a deep connection between cancel culture and friendship because it lacks the things I just spoke of, including patience, compassion, the ability to listen deeply beneath the headlines, what is there more? And it we are so panicked and frustrated and irritated and scared that the cancel culture is beginning to permeate all aspects of our lives. And
Absolutely.
go ahead, Ashok, with
No, no,
this.
no. Thank you so much for bringing the rubber band analogy to cancel culture and making the connection between what happens in a personal friendship and what happens with a campus, what happens with society at large. It's the same rubber band at work. Thank you so much for drawing that. Leo asks a couple of questions which are very important. I'll try to take on one of them right now. Leo says, what can we learn about remote romantic relationships as well? Are digital technology giving us the illusion that we can sustain long distance relationships? So, Leo, as someone who has done internet dating, as someone who has had long distance relationships, I can say that these are, it's a word I like, and I'm not sure I'm going to be pronouncing it right, ersatz relationships.
Ah,
They are four relationships. They have all the kind of atmospherics of a relationship without the substance. So, for instance, it's one thing for me. Now I'm happily married, so hey, this is a hypothetical. But it's one thing for me to find an astonishing woman in Bali or in Montreal and to say, wow, we are soulmates because we read the same books, we finish each other's jokes, and on the net, and every time we meet for a wild weekend, we connect so beautifully, but we are not in each other's daily lives. That is the definition of a honeymoon, a long, stretched out honeymoon. The problem with such romantic liaisons is that they forever live in the mythical world. Real life is about what happens when you wake up in the morning and you have to deal with this person's bad moods and bad breath. It has to do with what happens when you want a quiet evening at home and the other person wants to go out clubbing. That is where real romantic relationships either flourish or they die. So I just want to say there's something magical about long distance and internet relationships. It's easy because so little is at stake. So that's my quick response to that. I want to take on another question. Uh, Leo says, and friendship is building trust. What is building distrust? Is the lack of interpersonal relationship in person, does the lack of interpersonal relationships build distrust? So I think Daniel has also spent a lot of time as a psychologist working on this. And I'm going to give you mine, and Daniel, feel free to add to this.
sure.
Trust is very difficult to believe. Very difficult to build. I'll give an example. I have been working with colleagues almost completely online for 6 months, 1 year, 2 years. I cannot, in any honesty, say that we trust each other. Trust is a deep thing. I may count on this person to respond to an email, to do a task, but trust is much deeper than that. The problem with internet relationships, the problem with long distance digital relationships is that you are not giving yourself enough time to make those connections with the other person and keep making multiple webbed connections to the extent where you can say, I know exactly how the other person's rubber band will move. There is one definition that I have for trust is it's based on reliability and predictability. And that is so important. If you don't know how I'm going to move, how I'm going to respond to a joke of yours, how I'm going to respond to your use of an offensive word. And if you don't know that, you cannot trust me. If you don't know that I will be generous when you disappoint me, there isn't trust. Daniel.
Well, ditto to start. I want to add one more piece, and that is consistency in terms of the development of
Thank
trust.
you.
And I got to add one more: vulnerability.
Yes.
And this is something we talked about earlier with befriending people half a world away. Um, it's still very, very safe. And we're not vulnerable because we're really not working out conflict that impacts on our daily lives.
Absolutely.
And so when you talk about building distrust, it's really the inability to build trust. And without that, you really don't have a connection. I mean, you have anything that's safe, a professional connection, whether it's because there's a power asymmetry or whatever, it doesn't matter. It's still safe. Even if it ends up in the termination of a job, I've been through that. It's still safe. It's not going to permeate the core of my being other than maybe being reactive over some situation. And distrust, as profound as trust is, distrust may be even more profound because it sets us further and further apart without the hope or the interest or the potential of making that back. And so when there is distrust, and I've experienced this myself, you have to both be willing to put yourselves in a vulnerable space to negotiate that, not knowing what the outcome is.
Absolutely.
And that's why I don't believe in the term conflict resolution.
Right.
I think it's nonsense. And so do I think conflict transformation is nonsense. These are big buzzwords in the field. I think of conflict as being inevitable in friendships, and it's a terrible thing to waste. And what we can hope for is conflict response. The idea that I care enough about a breakdown with you, Ashok, or anyone else to say, I'm going to put myself out there, take a risk, take a chance, and see what happens without knowing. That is really the only opportunity to try to build trust or rebuild trust, in my opinion.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm with you all the way there. And I just want to reflect on something. One of the things, because you see, a lot of what I do is teach. And before that, a lot of what I did was as a facilitator and as a mediator. And one of the things I've realized is that young people today, the moment they see a hint of conflict, they're gone. They're gone. It's like, this is not for me. I don't need this shit. I mean, this is a bad match. This is not meant to be. It doesn't even matter if it's not romantic. Even at a professional level, they shut down. Why? And one of the main reasons is because they didn't grow up with team sports. They didn't grow up with scrambling over the fence with neighborhood kids, with fighting with siblings, and learning how to still love them and to still enjoy their company. Way too many people, and this comes back to COVID. It comes back to individuated technologies. The less the opportunities you have to scrape your knee, tangle with, get irritated, irritate someone, and still love their presence, the greater your capacity to build trust, to sustain relationships. I know way too many beautiful, wonderful people in their 40s who have not learned how to manage a relationship or a friendship because they are so terrified. Daniel, and you put it well, conflict is inevitable and it's a terrible waste if you don't engage with it. They are terrified of engaging with it. It's not even conflict, a simple disagreement. The polarization in the US and India right now, political polarization, is because the moment you hear that someone is Republican or in India, you hear that someone is Hindutva, you are gone. You don't want to even spend any time with them, even if you used to know them from high school. So this is awesome, Daniel. It's been really really good. I know there are a couple of other questions from Quanta and Patrick. Maybe we can these questions can be given back to or shared with us, Daniel, and we can write separately to those whose questions we haven't answered.
Sure.
But I want to ask you my a typical checkout question, and my typical question is this, and I hope you can give a atypical answer. I'm putting pressure on you now because
Yes, I
you're
hear
always
it.
on.
Throw the question. Throw it.
Daniel, what is one thing you learned today?
Well, this is something I've been really looking at for myself personally in my friendships and in my own heart, which is practicing patience. This may, again, sound a bit trite, but in those moments where you and I had disagreements during this conversation, I was able to take enough of a step back to be able to say, it's okay, breathe through it. Let's build on this where it's going. Don't necessarily look for points of agreement. Let it sit and be present with it, and don't worry about it. And I think in my professional career as an academic, as a writer, community leader, whatever you want to call it, that's been a concern. And I feel like I've done some posturing around that. And when the sparks have flown, even though they've been low-level sparks between you and I here, I've taken it out of curiosity and remembering that the friendship that we have is much deeper than any individual disagreement. And I don't have to resolve it. I can just respond and feel safe and comfortable in that because I'm doing it with respect and integrity in my belief. And that's an ongoing lesson. And it came back to me today.
Wonderful. I'm so glad.
Can you
Thank
speak of
you for
yours
sharing
too?
it. I will. I will.
Okay.
And I have to say, mine is at two levels. One is I'm so glad that you and I were able to have this conversation. And my takeaways or learnings are at two levels. The first one is personal, that you and I are such different people, and it's so wonderful we were able to have such a long friendship and mutual respect. And I realize even more so that we need to be engaged so much more. And I feel sometimes that it's almost like I have woken up like Rip Van Winkle after 20 years, and I'm encountering you because you've changed and I've changed, but we changed in different ways. So I'm very conscious that we haven't really engaged in each other's lives for almost 18 to 20 years now. So I've learned that I haven't spent as much time in your life. So that's a kind of a wake up call for me. So that's one. The other learning that I have and take away is very depressing. And I've never been afraid of the negative. It's very depressing how many excuses we as a people make for ourselves in order to continue leading the lives that work for us. When the call of the hour is to stop doing what we have always done. We all want change. We want climate change to stop. We want the climate crisis to be resolved. We want equality, justice. We want women's voices. We want everything as long as someone else does it. But our lives somehow seem sacrosanct. We want to keep doing things our way and hope for the world to change. And terrifies me, because that's not what happens when your house is burning. You are scrambling. You are calling 911. You're going to the neighbors, picking up buckets of water and sand, and desperately doing. I don't see that sense of desperation. And that for me is terrifying. We have a responsibility to be desperate right now. So I feel, I feel really uh, almost tormented by that. Thank you very much. Would you like to please have the last word, and then
Well, I don't know if there's ever really a last word in these conversations, but because of time, I understand. Ashok, I'm very touched by what you just said. And there's one word that I just want to get into this conversation. It's not the be all and end all. But to me, I'm just going to say that the deepest, most intimate friendships are the practice of personal sacrifice.
mm,
And how willing are we, am I, are you, the listeners out there, to make the sacrifices, to not hide behind busyness and the dozens of other excuses that we all make. I mean, it's just part of our lives and our lexicon. Uh, how can we possibly drop those excuses to meet what's real when there's conflict, when there's difference, when there's genuine need? And I say this having lost my mom just 2 weeks ago. When people reach out, I am incredibly grateful for that, and I don't take it for granted, and it holds meaning. And so to me, I just want to say that friendship is about making sacrifice for another person. And
thank
I'll
you.
end with that.
What a wonderful way to stop. And I would also give a plug for democracy, saying democracy without sacrifice is Disney World. It doesn't exist. So thank you so much, everyone who's been with us live. Thank you if you have joined on YouTube beyond the date of the live conversation. Thank you for all those people who have asked wonderful questions. And I also want to remind you folks that our next critical thinking course is starting on October 17th. And it is going to be a very different way of looking at your own thinking process. I would encourage you to spread the word. We are looking for a few good thinkers. We also have a diversity course that is starting on November 6th. And particularly in a time like this, when everyone is talking about the importance of diversity and equality and equity and inclusion, I think this 12 session course will give you a really disciplined, robust, and possibly provocative look at the entire subject. So thank you very much, folks. Thank you for attending. Do keep coming. And meanwhile, thank you too to Shri and Leo for helping put this together.